Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Rein Müllerson, the former president of the law school of Estonia's Tallinn University. Rein, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for saying yes, because you recently wrote and published a very interesting paper. And you just told me that one of the things that makes it also interesting is that it was published with Oxford University Press, because Oxford University Press is a Western publisher, and there were some critical voices who didn't really want that paper because you're writing about the revolutions in superpower dynamics and how everything is changing, and it's not changing very much in the favor of Western and NATO powers, and you describe what's going on. In this, can you give us a little bit of the arguments of the paper, and also your take at whether the recent renaming of Defense Department in the US into Department of War actually supports your argument or not?
It's an interesting question. I am not so sure whether this a title or name remains after Donald Trump has gone. Probably they will rename once again, because every country has ministers of defense now. Oh, the King's College, where I worked for almost 18 years, has the War Studies Department. It is a British tradition, maybe. All the other countries, states have their defense ministers or departments. But it is not, because if everybody only defends itself from attacks, so there won't be any conflict, any wars. But unfortunately, it is not so, and we see many conflicts in today's world, not only between the West and Russia on the territory of Ukraine, but in the Middle East and some other places as well. So I don't think that the name remains, but it reflects the reality in the world, really.
And so, considering that reality, what is this new superpower dynamics that you see, this geopolitical reconfiguration that's going on? Could you describe it to us?
Yes, I write about it in my article, and I believe that the conflict or war in Ukraine epitomizes and accelerates this geopolitical as well as geoeconomic reconfiguration of the world or international relations. This is so, but however, this process started already long time ago, even before the February of 2022, where the so-called full-scale Russian invasion happened. I would say that in 2022, it was not a full-scale invasion at all. It is a very limited use of military force, in my opinion, in order to force Ukraine to negotiate in accordance with the Minsk agreement, more or less, and I'll come back maybe to that later. It has become more or less full-scale conflict now. Yeah, that's true. But then it was not in any way a full-scale invasion. And it started even before 2014, when the coup d'etat happened in Kiev, in Ukraine. And then I saw with my own eyes, though on TV, I was not in Kiev or in Ukraine at that time, how Senator John McCain expressed his and personal and American support for the opposition. Can you imagine that, for example, the famous Russian politician and a bit clownish Zhirinovsky going to Estonia, let's say, advocating the opposition. So it is not unimaginable. And Victoria Nuland and with Geoffrey Pyatt, the then American ambassador to Kiev, they discussed the composition of the government in Ukraine. It was such an arrogant and flagrant violation of the non-interference principle in international law. So you can't imagine it. In that respect, I recall that it was in 1967 when General de Gaulle was in Montreal, in Canada. He made a speech, was carried away a bit probably with the warm welcome, and he finished his speech, "Vive la Quebec libre," welcome the free Quebec. And you know what happened? Yes, de Gaulle resigned a year later, but during this period, the relations between Canada and France were very frosty. So it was considered unacceptable, such interference in domestic affairs of Canada. And this reconfiguration of the international relations started, in my opinion, when the Cold War ended. It had been before for many decades already. Balance of power, Cold War system, then emerged rather short unipolar moment in international relations. There was one hyperpower to use the words of Hubert Vedrenon, the former foreign minister of France. And this was meant to be an American century, but it was shortened by the series of mistakes made by different American administrations, such as the war against terror, for example, especially its extension to Afghanistan, where the US and its allies stayed for more than 20 years. The attempts to democratize the wider Middle East, as it was said, I would say that this was such a Fukuyamian or Fukuyama's moment or period in history. So Fukuyama was criticized, and he even criticized his own works later. But nevertheless, this was the West was, at least the West was Fukuyamian, and not only the West, many people in other countries as well. But meanwhile, China continued its peaceful rise. And also Russia came out of coma, which was self-inflicted, but also a kind of assisted suicide, I believe, because many in the West wanted to weaken Russia. Especially Dick Cheney expressed this view that the smaller Russia would be, the better it would be. And today, one would be, in my opinion, justified to generalize that the world has reached a tipping point, characterized by the efforts of the until recently hegemonic West to preserve and also extend its hegemony or domination by containing potential or actual rivals, as well as trying to co-opt those who would prefer to benefit from remaining neutral, maybe a bit later about this neutrality, really true. Who will benefit from not taking sides in this new superpower rivalry in the world. And using this term tipping a tipping point, I mean that there is a relative balance between the old world, that's to say the Western-dominated world, and the emerging new multipolar world. There are signs that this relative balance won't last, in my opinion, wouldn't last long, really. The West is continuing to make mistakes that are counterproductive to its efforts to prolong its hegemony. For example, the West, particularly the United States, as well as its European vassals, I would say has actualized the so-called Kissinger's cauchemar or nightmare. You remember probably that Henry Kissinger, when he was the Secretary of State and advisor to President Nixon, he had this nightmare that the Soviet Union then and China would combine forces and thereby oppose the American dominance or hegemony in the world. And now, especially the Trump administration, but not only the Trump administration, has done exactly that Russia and China and Russia have become almost allies and partners in the world. This is probably, and especially one more. This is not only the conflict in between the West and Russia in Ukraine, because the crimes against humanity, war crimes, and even genocide committed by Israel against Palestinians, and its bullying behavior vis-à-vis its neighbors. For example, the recent attack against Qatar will turn the Arab and Muslim world, and not only this world, against Israel, but also against its supporters in the West. This is what I would characterize as a radical reconfiguration of the world. It affects not only international relations, but domestic policies of many countries as well. These sovereignist forces have become more influential in many countries, including Western countries, and India has a very interesting position now, wants to be, well, let's say, also neutral, not to be dragged into the conflict rivalry between China and the West. This is what I believe, how I would characterize this radical reconfiguration of the world today.
I agree with you, and this is what we are seeing at the moment is a change in what kind of politics of individual states is possible. Excuse me, and it's also a rethinking of how we are viewing the trajectory that we are in. And let me just ask you this, because for the longest time, for the last 7-8 years, I had in the back of my mind this question. We were calling before. Very recently, we called the period between 1989 and, the 2020s, we called that period the post-Cold War. To me, I always thought this description cannot stick because you cannot be post something forever. There needs to be something next. So we will probably reimagine what we call the post-Cold War. And it seems to me, as you just used the word, that we are now conceptualizing what we are living in, from going from the bipolarity of the Cold War into a unipolar moment, into a multipolar moment, which I think is part of this rethinking of what we are in. I wonder if you see it like that as well. And secondly, if the multipolarity is what we should expect, and secondly, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs recently made this observation that what states should strive for is not spheres of influence, but spheres of security, of shared security, and neutrals being part of that because they de-escalate the security dilemma on both sides. And in a sense, what we are witnessing is still the United States clinging to this concept of having a sphere of interference, and that Ukraine is the place where it is allowed to interfere, and in Georgia and in Armenia, and it will try to do so with its little color revolutions because that's what it's very good at. And we are seeing how this isn't working anymore. It's like it's now hitting the bricks wall, and maybe that's part of this change. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I believe you are right, and especially I like this. You spoke about spheres of influence, spheres of interference, and so on. I would say that yes, there are spheres of interest, security interest, including, for example, in Ukraine. I would say that Russia has an interest of having not influencing. Maybe Russia wants to influence as well, but the main problem is to have a sphere of interest, which means that there is in place of in Ukraine in place a government which is not at least hostile to Russia, and similarly. You can see, and you can see it's interesting also that it is not Russia which went closer and closer to the West. It was NATO which came to the borders of Russia. And also it is not China which is going to the Caribbean and to Mexico, Canada. It is the United States which is coming to closer to China. And maybe interesting to recall that China generally has not seen much interest in dominating the world. It may change a bit. You remember it was in the 15th century, probably during the Ming dynasty in China, when there was this famous Zheng He or He admiral who had a fleet and traveled to Africa, at least to the Middle East. Some write that he went even to America. I don't know. I have some doubts about it. But nevertheless, China burned its fleet and started to building the Great Wall of China to isolate itself from the north. Why I say maybe China has changed also because of this policy of isolation. China, which was the dominant force in the world, was much more developed than the West at that time, became weaker and was colonized or semi-colonized by European powers. Maybe China has learned a lesson and it is not anymore having so peaceful diplomacy or trying to be isolated as it was during the Ming dynasty centuries ago. So who knows?
Yeah, but I mean, even now, Chinese foreign policy is concentrated very strongly on trade policy. It's all about trade. It's all about creating links and connections and accessibility.
That's true. Yeah, but China doesn't want to be isolated anymore,
Yeah.
and so China has interest in not having. Uh, I know John Mearsheimer like many, and I probably like most of his views. And he, as an American, says that China is a threat to America. China is a threat to American domination, hegemony in the world, probably, but not not a threat to the U.S. or Western countries as such.
I would second that opinion. And the one point where Professor Mearsheimer might be questioned on his theory is because he universalizes the Euro-American experience and says like every state will act like that. So the question is that true for civilizational states like China and Russia? But let me maybe go to the second topic that we want to discuss, and that's the root causes. Vladimir Putin keeps talking about the root causes of the Ukraine war and that those need to be addressed in order to get to a peace agreement, even while Russia is continues with the military arm of its dual track strategy to get to a Russian-friendly resolution of this slaughterhouse and this tragedy. Can you maybe tell us how you interpret what are the root causes, the way that the Russians see it, and how do the Russians actually view that they need to be addressed, and how does that play together with the way the West is trying uh, to achieve its goals?
Yeah. I could enlist these root causes maybe in a short way and try to explain them in the following way. First of all, it is the expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia. It was promised, if people remember, that this was an oral promise, yes, by George W. Bush, George Bush, the father, and his Secretary of State, not to expand when the negotiations on the reunification of Germany were going on, promised not to expand or extend NATO an inch towards the east. So if Russia withdraws its troops from Germany, from other countries, that NATO will not go to the east. This promise with oral, but it was given against Russia's promise to do what Russia really, or the Soviet Union under Gorbachev started doing, withdrawing from East Germany and helping thereby this process of reunification of Germany. And as an international lawyer, I would say that there are cases, even in the International Court of Justice and in his predecessor, which was under the League of Nations, also the Permanent Court of International Justice, cases which show that these oral promises, this tit for tat, I do this if you do that, they have legal force as well. So therefore, we would say that this was a violation of not only this political understanding, but also of international law when this process of enlargement of NATO started. There have been probably 4 or 5 such stages in this NATO enlargement. This is number one, as Pope Francis eloquently put it, NATO was barking too loud at the gates of Russia. And then I would name the non-observance of the Minsk Accord. And I believe this rather limited Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 happened because one of the reasons was that why Russia did it was to force Ukraine to implement the Minsk Agreements. And also it is interesting to note that in 2022, in February, before the 24th of February, when Russia used this limited military force directly in Ukraine, there was a series of bombardments increasing gradually and observed by the OSCE observers, which intensified immediately before Russia invaded with its own troops Ukraine. I would maybe compare it with the situation which happened in the world in 1962, the so-called Caribbean crisis. For example, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, then completely in accordance with international law, started establishing its medium-range missiles on the territory of Cuba. Cuba was in agreement with it. The Soviet Union was in agreement. There was no violation of international law. But John Kennedy, a very, in my opinion, very, let's say, cautious President of the United States, one of the best ones, but his term was unfortunately very short. He was even ready also to start a nuclear conflict in order to force the Soviet Union to withdraw these missiles. And you see, the American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine would be like the sword of Damocles hanging over Russia, very close. Of course, Russia was against the NATO membership for Estonia, for the Baltic countries as well. But Russia was weak and it couldn't respond adequately. But Ukraine is completely different matter. I recall in March 2014, President Putin made a speech where he used, I would call a good geopolitical joke, saying that the US Marines are generally good guys, but he would prefer to invite them to Sevastopol, the important port city in the Crimea, instead of being invited by the Americans to visit them in Sevastopol. So I believe this is one of the such it is a joke, but it is a geopolitical reality. As I am not Russian, I don't have any emotional, let's say, attitude towards the Crimea and the Christianization of Russia also there. But nevertheless, geopolitically, of course, Ukraine and the Crimea being de facto de jure under control of NATO, it would be a different matter for Russia.
I have a question at this point because you observed this very closely and firsthand, like the 1990s, like when the Soviet Union, against the wishes of Gorbachev, split up because of these. I mean, because Yeltsin and Russian nationalism, right? That said, like we ended here and we're gonna do our own thing. The 15 republics and 10 successor states. It was always understood that Ukraine was special because there were two special NATO talking groups created, one for Ukraine, one for Russia, in which you had the NATO Ukraine and NATO Russia. I forgot what their name was, but it was a special kind of thing that was created. I mean, a meeting ground that was created in order to discuss those. And Ukraine, it was always clear, was special to Russia. But Russia in the 1990s seems to have had, or at least talked less about this, about NATO being a threat. And we know that Russia even several times hinted at wanting to join NATO. And so there was a different perception of how NATO could become an all-European security structure and even a Eurasian security structure, something like a successor to the OECD, like with a military component. So to realize this dream of a common European home and a common security structure in which the security of Russia is part of the security of the United States, and therefore you have a balance. Can you speak to that a little bit and how this perception, maybe also in Russia, about NATO must have changed?
It has changed considerably now, of course, in Russia as well. But then, yes, not only under President Yeltsin, but when Vladimir Putin became president of Russia, Russia expressed this view and at least hinted that it would like also to join NATO. And in such a case, NATO would have become a collective security organization instead of collective defense organization. Because these collective defense organizations, they are military blocked, and starting already from the Peloponnesian War, if not earlier, when there were two of these blocks, Delhi and World League, and the league led by Sparta. This led this situation, the world of military blocks, led to the Peloponnesian War and other. There are other such examples. So in Russia was simply weak, and it was not so important. The Baltic countries and let's say the former Eastern Bloc allies of the Soviet Union, they becoming members of NATO, it was not so vitally important for Russia. Of course, now that things are different, and I would say maybe it is unfortunate from my point of view that in Russia there are prevailing now at least forces which consider Russia to be completely, let's say, Asian oriented country, and they don't believe, many of them at least, don't believe that it would be possible in the nearest future at least to have any good relations with Europe. I don't think so. Therefore, of course, the current leadership in Europe, yes, they have made their careers, political careers, supporting Ukraine all. And if we take President Macron, who is very unpopular and fighting for his future in France, or Keir Starmer in the UK, also very unpopular. So they all have built their political careers, including mainly now the support of Ukraine. And therefore, until this generation of these people, and also propaganda, those who use propaganda, anti-Russian propaganda, they are in power and influential, things won't change. But I believe Russia has interest in cooperating not only with China, with Asian countries, with India, but also with the Western countries. And there would be new generations of people, not immediately, who would then have, in the West, I mean, who would have normal relations, maybe even friendly relations with Russia. So unfortunately, there are very dominant forces in Russia who consider that the future of Russia is in the East only.
I mean, it's a good thing that Russia cooperates with the East more now. I mean, any form of cooperation and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, shared security is a good thing. But one thing, I mean, the political and the economical backbone and to a large extent head of Russia is geographically located on the European part. So I don't think Russia can ever change that fact. And the second thing is, if Europe ever starts to realize that it itself is part of Eurasia and actually realizes that, transatlanticism, maybe there's transcontinentalism that would rather help us, then at that point, I guess they have to knock at the door of Russia and say, like, hey, would you let us back in? I'm sorry for being absent for 500 years, but can we join again the rest of the continent?
And culturally, of course, Russia is European. Notwithstanding these influential today forces who claim that the future of Russia is in the East, whether with China, India, and other Asian countries. Culturally, and even President Putin spoke during his first term, at least, or until his Munich speech in 2007, spoke about Russia as a European country.
Yeah. So, I mean, these things are ups and downs, and it's also part of speech acts. But let's maybe turn to the final point, and I need to skip one question. I'm sorry, but I would like to discuss with you neutrality as a de-escalatory part of the security policy of spheres of security, and how you are interpreting Russia, especially as how are they geared toward this idea of using neutrality as a tool of international politics? We see that even now, even after 3.5 years of war, Russia is the one that demands the neutrality of Ukraine. It's an essential part of the what Russia says has to happen. Do you see that also play out in other parts?
Yeah, but may I make a comment about your previous
Yes.
question? It is interesting that it was in 1968 when Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor to security advisor to Jimmy Carter, he in his interview, and I have a text of this interview, said that he and the president, Jimmy Carter, wanted Russia to have its own Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they purposefully dragged Russia into Afghanistan.
Yes.
And then the interviewer asked Brzezinski, but you created Islamic terrorism by that. Oh, he said, Islamic terrorism, this is nonsense. This is nothing in comparison with the disappearance of the Soviet Union as the main threat. That comment, and it was foolish, of course, for the Soviet Union to go to Afghanistan, because everybody in Afghanistan has finished very poorly. Any invader, be they the Brits or the Soviets, and therefore, but Ukraine is completely different. Ukraine is very important security-wise for, and otherwise economically even for Russia. So this comment coming now to your question about neutrality, I believe neutrality has become much more important concept today than it has been before. And why? As I said, I already said about it, that first it is that there are more and more states which don't want to be dragged into this rivalry between the superpowers. Today it is China, Russia, and the West. They want to be neutral to trade and have good, relatively good relations with all other countries like India, for example, now, or Georgia in the Caucasus. I don't mean the U.S. State, American state, but in the Caucasus, Georgia. It wants to be neutral, not to be dragged into a conflict, especially military conflict, with Russia. And you'll probably remember, especially as a Swiss, that there was such a Swiss diplomat, Heidi Tagliavini, who wrote a report about the conflict, the armed conflict between Georgia and Russia. And though this was a very balanced and too balanced report, even in my opinion, but one of the conclusions was that the conflict started President Saakashvili of Georgia. And I have friends and colleagues and students in Georgia who confirm the former, for example, the former Speaker of the Parliament, Georgia, that this was Saakashvili who wanted to use this moment that Putin was, there were the Olympic Games in 2008, Putin was away, and Medvedev was in charge then, and Saakashvili used this moment in order to start a conflict with Russia.
And only few months earlier, you had the Bucharest summit of NATO, in which NATO promised membership to Ukraine and Georgia. So in any shape or form, like Saakashvili, if he wanted to test the waters, that was the moment to do, and he did. And Heidi Tagliavini, in her report, she actually said, no, the first shots were shot by the Georgians.
And Russian peacekeepers were killed, if I remember correctly. Probably the Americans would have used high altitude bombardment as they did and cowardly they did it in against Serbia in 1999 when there was a conflict with Kosovo. So Russia used relatively small scale force against Georgia as well, and Georgia now doesn't want to remain more or less neutral. And then, of course, this neutrality, as I said, that many states today don't want to take sides. They would benefit from both, let's say, rivals, China and the West, especially the United States. And of course, there is this specific point of neutrality, and this is the main claim of Russia, that Ukraine become a neutral state. And I believe this Ukraine itself would benefit from it. Unfortunately, we don't know how the conflict will end. Probably it will escalate for a while at least. But when it ends, then Ukraine would benefit the status of neutrality, cooperating with both the West and Russia. So this is this very specific point of neutrality, having neutrality officially recognized, maybe confirmed by the UN Security Council as well. So like Austria's neutrality after the Second World War, something like that. And this would be let's say, the best guarantee of security for Ukraine as well.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people don't understand. Neutrality is a security guarantee if you make sure that both sides don't want to attack you. There's no better security guarantee than not having enemies. I don't know why the West has so much trouble understanding that. Nobody in Germany thinks about deterring France or France Germany because they're now friends. If you make friends on all sides, you have the best security guarantee ever. In its weird sense, what we are seeing at the moment reminds me of the early Cold War, in which Russia, as the Soviet Union, offered neutrality to a reunified Germany in 53, 54, and in the Stalin notes. And it wasn't taken, and it took the Soviet Union too long to realize that they can set an example with Austria, which finally they did. But by the time they agreed and successfully made sure that Austria became neutral, West Germany had already joined NATO, so it was too late. In a sense, wouldn't it be strategically advisable if Russia approached Georgia and said, "Dear Georgia, if you put neutrality into your constitution, then we will help you with these territories and show that something good can come out of this, because we want to impose it. We want it for Ukraine too. So we use this as an example."
I don't know. Probably Georgia is not going to enshrine such a concept in its constitution. But what Georgia is doing, Georgia wants still to join the European Union, and Russia is not against Ukraine joining also the European Union. I don't think that it would happen. I believe the European Union, the European countries which have supported Ukraine, should accept Ukraine, but it would be rather, let's say, Ukrainization of the European Union than the other way around. Therefore, I don't believe, it is not that some countries, Slovakia and Hungary, may be against it, but I don't think that it would happen. So, but at least Russia is not against Ukraine joining the European Union, though the European Union has become very militarized today, of course. So, but Georgia wants to join the European Union. Russia is not against it, but Georgia doesn't want don't want to accept these conditions imposed by the European Union, not to have anything to do with Russia, then of course Georgia could join the European Union. And I saw the foreign minister of Estonia supporting the opposition in Georgia. It reminds me Senator McCain supporting opposition in Ukraine. When Yanukovych was the president, the lawfully elected president of Ukraine, and we can see what are the results for Ukraine.
The double speak of these countries is just incredible because the same Kaja Kallas, Estonian Kaja Kallas, who's running EU foreign policy, she recently visited, of course, the strongman of Armenia and praising him for cracking down on the opposition in Armenia, which is now, for all intents and purposes in prison and so on. I mean, all rules are out of the window. But it's not the act. Is it for us or against us? And they support that. I mean, it's highly hypocritical.
Oh yeah, she is very ignorant of history. Recently, she said that Russia and China didn't contribute much to the end of the Second World War. Of course, Russia or the Soviet Union made the biggest contribution to the defeat of the Nazi Germany in Europe, and contributed also to the defeat of Japan.
Yes.
In 1945. And China also. China didn't play much role in Europe, of course, but China also contributed to the end of the conflict in Asia against Japan. So Kaja Kallas is a very ignorant person, and she is complaining about the Soviet Union. She didn't have much sugar to eat, but her father was a high official party member. High party member in the Soviet Estonia, and so her childhood was very nice in the Soviet Union. She's complaining about things which she at least didn't suffer at all in the Soviet Estonia.
Yeah. I repeat this a couple of times, but I say it again. We just need to remember that the current European Union foreign policy and diplomacy is run by the Soviet-born daughter of a communist apparatchik in the Soviet Union, and this is where we are, and this to me explains some of the technocratic nature of where we are, of who gets propelled to the top. It's definitely those who are very, very good at integrating into the power structures of the time, whatever they are.
Exactly.
Is there something that you would still like to discuss when it comes to this neutrality question, or should I just give you the floor for your final remarks?
No, probably. I can simply repeat that neutrality is important in this large and loose sense, states not wanting to take sides, and it is important for Ukraine, and maybe for some other countries also close to the borders of these new superpower rivalry. And we have had a very interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we didn't speak very much about Trump, Deng Xiaoping, and Gorbachev and their respective reforms. And when some of my friends who really managed to read my very long article up to the end were surprised that I had compared with these very different personalities. And my comparison was only one thing I would emphasize, that they were at the pinnacle of this power at the moment when revolutionary situations occurred in their respective countries.
So you're talking about Deng Xiaoping in China and Donald Trump in the United States, right? That's the comparison you're making.
And also Gorbachev.
And Gorbachev. Yeah, please explain. Please explain. Let's take the time.
Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, because there is a revolutionary situation in the United States, and even more, in my opinion, in Western Europe. And there was such a situation in the 1970s, 80s, respectively, in China, when Deng Xiaoping started its reforms, which really made China finally great again, we would say. And there were the reforms in the Soviet Union, which started by Gorbachev, continued a bit by Yeltsin, but they led to the disappearance of the Soviet Union, to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was not altogether a bad thing for some. Estonia became independent country and some others, but these reforms failed. Gorbachev reforms failed. And we can see that the West welcomed very much Gorbachev reforms while condemning Chinese reforms, because they have become now excessive, which have made China what is it now. I remember even that I read years ago an article in the Figaro, the French newspaper. The French journalist interviewed an intellectual in Iran. Then Rouhani, you probably remember, was in 2015, I believe it was president of Iran. And this Iranian intellectual said that Rouhani, unfortunately, will maybe Deng Xiaoping of China and not Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. So why to welcome these failed reforms and diminish the results of these successful reforms to Deng Xiaoping? And in my opinion, it is that in the West there is only, and not only in the West during this Fukuyamian period, it was that there is only one way forward, progressive, and this is the liberal democracy and globalization and market economy. So this is, maybe I would like to use this opportunity to convey also this message.
Yes, the West in general is very bad at accepting that there are other civilizational models that can also be successful in the sense of creating prosperity for the masses. I have some of my African friends from Tanzania once told me, you guys in Europe, first you come and you bring us a book and tell us to love the book and kill the gays, and now you're telling us to burn the book and love the gays. Can you please make up your mind? The West is very good at telling everybody else how to run their show.
The world is simply too big, complicated, and diverse to have this Christianity, Buddhism, or let's say Islamism dominate this rich carpet where only one way dominates, one pattern dominates. And it is even good. There was Wolfgang Streeck, I don't know, I don't German Streeck. He's a German author who recently wrote in his book was published probably at the beginning of this year even. And in this book, he says that the more democratic is the world is, the more idiosyncratic will be societies in it. They will choose their own ways. Of course, borrowing, maybe rubbing shoulders with their neighbors, borrowing from them, but then fitting it into their own history, religion, culture, and so on. So this is what is, I believe, what is happening in this new multipolar world.
Wonderful words to end this discussion. Dr. Rein Müllerson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. Goodbye.